Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Balser Symposium. My name is Tim Bresnahan. I'm the VP of Advancement and Philanthropic Services here at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. And I'm so delighted to be here with you all this morning, kicking things off, along with our other co-partners who are grateful for the support and partnership at the United Way and the Jewish Foundation. So thank you. As you all know, here at the Community Foundation, we work with donors to help them achieve their goals through DAFs and other giving vehicles, and none of that would be possible without the wonderful support of the professional advisor community here in Atlanta. So we're all grateful for those of you on the phone, those of you joining via video for your support, and I'm going to kick it over to our other partners to introduce themselves and welcome guests as well.
Morning.
Oh, hey, good morning. I'm Margaret Adams with the United Way of Greater Atlanta, and so pleased to have all of you here this morning, and pleased to be with our colleagues from the Atlanta Jewish Foundation, Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, and for you, the Atlanta Charitable Advisor Network and this Balser Symposium. It's wonderful to see all you leaders, many faces that are well known, and that you're guiding the future of individual philanthropic passion and investment. This is such a sacred trust and relationship, and we're just thrilled to be here today. We would just leave it with an invitation that anytime any of you would want to come down to United Way and learn more about our mission and what we do, we would love to see you. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Good morning. My name is Lindsay Kopecki. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer for the Atlanta Jewish Foundation. It's wonderful to be with all of you this morning. Thank you so much for spending time to learn with us. And a special thank you to the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta and United Way of Greater Atlanta for your partnership. For the past 19 years, the Balser Symposium has been a catalyst for collaborative philanthropic conversations, furthering our understanding as a group on how to integrate philanthropy in business and family matters. So although he is not with us this morning, I would like to acknowledge Jack Balser, to whom we owe this incredible commitment to philanthropic education. For 13 years, Jack served as endowment director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta. To honor the outstanding contributions that Jack made to our community, a generous group of donors started an endowment with the Atlanta Jewish Foundation to ensure we continue to educate professional advisors about inspiring philanthropic giving conversations. At the Atlanta Jewish Foundation, we often use a quote that comes from one of our sacred texts, the Talmud. My ancestors planted for me, so I must plant for my children. Our goal is to make philanthropy personal, meaningful, and tied to the values that you hold dear. And just like the generous investment that was made in Jack Balser's honor many years ago, so much of the work we do with our donors and clients today will have ripple effects far into the future. It is also my honor to thank Greenberg Traurig for making such a significant investment in our collective work at this year's Balser Symposium, as this year's Balser Symposium presenting sponsor. Greenberg Traurig LLP has more than 2,750 attorneys in 48 locations in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. The firm is a 2022 BTI highly recommended law firm for superior client service and is consistently among the top firms in the Am Law Global 100 and NLJ 500. Greenberg Traurig is Mansfield Rule Certified Plus by the Diversity Lab and is recognized for powering its U.S. offices with 100% renewable energy, as certified by the Center for Resource Solutions Green E Energy as a member of the U.S. EPA's Green Partnership Program. The firm is known for its philanthropic giving, innovation, diversity, and pro bono work. At Greenberg Traurig, they understand their clients' businesses and offer them a highly entrepreneurial approach to legal counsel. Their multidisciplinary team includes senior lawyers who have served as chief legal officers at major multinational companies and have spent years solving real-world problems in the business, political, and legal environments of major commercial centers. They also recognize that clients expect and are entitled to high-quality legal work and, equally important, superior client service. Accordingly, they strive to provide their clients with the highest quality legal work and service at a reasonable cost. Greenberg Traurig, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tesh Patel, and I'm the chair of the Atlanta Charitable Advisors Committee, along with my co-chair, Mary Frances Callis. The Atlanta Charitable Advisors Network, or ACAN for short, it's a collaboration of the Community Foundation, the Atlanta Jewish Foundation, and the United Way of Greater Atlanta. The committee, which is comprised of advisors in the community, helps guide decision-making and outreach for ACAN's umbrella of events and programs, including this Balser Symposium, the Balser Celebration, and the Philanthropic Advisors Leadership Institute, as well as the Balser Giving Circle. All of them aim to provide educational and networking opportunities for charitably minded advisors. So I'd like to thank all of the members of this year's committee that you see on the screen in front of you. Or maybe we can pull that up here. Without these members, this event would not be possible. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this year's symposium, Dr. Paul Walpe. Dr. Walpe has stepped down as director of Emory's Center for Ethics after 16 years and is currently building a new center called the Emory Center for Peace Building and Conflict Transformation, or PACT for short. Today, he's going to be teaching us more about the ethics of legacy wealth transfer and philanthropy. And if you have any questions about Dr. Walpe's presentation, please direct them to the chat moderator and we'll try to address them in the Q&A that will follow.
Well, thanks very much, Tesh. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I am going to share some slides with you as I speak. I have been working at I worked at the Center for Ethics, as Tesh said, for 16 years and have just stepped down. And as the director of the Center for Ethics, and now as I tried to build this new Center for Peace Building and Conflict Transformation, philanthropy has been a very important part of my life as a recipient. I had to raise money at the center. I'm trying to raise money for my new center. And so the kind of work you do is very important to me personally. While Lindsay was talking, I added a slide to my presentation, and this is the slide I added. I just got back from Pakistan. And while I was in Pakistan, we went up to Hunza, which is a very famous place. It's up in the Himalayas, and it's famous internationally because the people there are amongst the oldest living people in the world. They're studied by scientists. This man is 96 years old, and if you met him, you'd think he was 70. He's full of energy and life, and he is called the cherry farmer. That's what they call him in Hunza. He's very famous in Hunza. He has planted over 600 cherry trees. And we had a panel of people. The woman who spoke to us was 103. And he said to us, they asked each of them what the secret to long life was. And he said two things. One thing he said was dancing. And then he got up and danced. And then at the end, by the way, he made us all get up and dance, which was the most delightful thing I've been a part of in a very, very long time. But the other thing he said was planting trees. And what he said was what Lindsay just said, what the Talmud tells us. He said, I'm very old now. I won't live to see most of the trees I've planted, but it is our obligation to plant those for the people who come after us. So this is a universal idea, this idea of legacy. So I'm going to just do three things in the short time that I have. First, I spent 40 years as an ethicist, and I'm going to try to distill what I learned over those 40 years in just a few minutes for you. Then I'm going to also talk very briefly about what I've learned and what I try to teach about how we make ethical decisions, which is a little different than what ethics is. And then finally say a few words about the kind of work you do. So what is ethics really? I don't think it is what most people think it is, or at least I think people think about what it is in a wrong way. And that's because I think we're taught about it in a wrong way. So two things. This is a little two-slide introduction that I give my students often. And the first and most important thing is that ethics is always about values. I've taught medical students for most of my career, and I give them this complex case, and then I ask them, what are the legal issues? What are the clinical issues? What are the social issues? And what are the ethical issues? And you'd be surprised at how much trouble they have untangling which are which. And then sort of the key to letting them differentiate the ethical issues from all the other issues in that complex case is, okay, what are the values here that we're working with? Name the values for me. And then the students begin to shout out values. And I say, let's work with those. And when we're working with values, we're working with ethics, but not values alone. The other exercise I give them is this one. And I want you all to think about it for just a second. You're on a ship, the ship wrecks in the middle of the sea, you're dumped in the ocean, you swim to a rock. So there's this one rock sticking out of the middle of the ocean. You climb up on the rock and wait till you are rescued. There's nothing living on the rock. You can't really reach the water. Can you do something unethical while you're sitting on that rock? And the students try to figure it out, and some of them come up with some things. I could plan someone's murder. I could try to throw rocks at the fish and kill one, but they have a really hard time coming up with a reason. And the reason that it's so difficult is because ethics is always about relationships. If you take away relationships, you take away ethics. And so since I took away all their relationships in this exercise, they have trouble figuring out how to be unethical. Very quick story about that. I spent many years, 15 years as the bioethicist for NASA, for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, where I met one guy who had the coolest job that there is. His name was John Rummel, and he was the chief of planetary protection. His job was to protect the Earth against any kind of pathogens that might come in from other planets, and also, though, to protect those planets. So when I first met him, he said, my job is to protect ecosystems of Moon and Mars. And I said to him, well, Mars I get, but the Moon, it's just a rock. It doesn't have an ecosystem. And he said a deep ethical insight, maybe without even realizing, or maybe he did, he was a bright guy. He said to me, that may be true, but if I don't think of the Moon as having an ecosystem, I can't protect it. In other words, he was saying, if I can't develop I can't develop a relationship with a rock. But if I imbue that rock with certain kinds of traits that I feel like I can have a relationship with, then I can protect it. I think that's a profound insight about the nature of relationships, ethics. So that brings us to my quirky definition of ethics. This is not one you're going to see in a textbook. It's just mine after 40 years. If you do look it up in the textbook, you'll see things like this. It's rules of behavior based on what is morally good and bad. And I'm going to tell you in a minute why I think that's a bad definition. It is a branch of philosophy. People major in ethics. They get PhDs in ethics through philosophy department. It is a moral philosophy. This is the American ethic versus the Chinese ethic or something like that. But for me, and I'm going to give you my definition of morality too, this is mine. And it is, ethics is how we determine, express, and assess our values in the world. And morality is how we establish, maintain, and conduct our relationships as expressions of those values. So ethics is about our values, and morality is about our relationships in lieu of those values. So here's why I think we're taught ethics incorrectly. If I asked you to fill in the following sentence, the blanks, almost everyone could do it virtually without thinking about it. Ethics is making decisions about what is blank and blank. And everybody knows they either say right and wrong or they say good and bad, one or the other. That's what we're taught. And I think that's right in kindergarten. Don't steal the candy bar, don't hit your sister. I mean, we're taught basic rights and wrongs. But as adults, our ethical decisions are almost never about rights and wrongs. What are they about? They're about values and conflict. That is, right and wrong is easy. When you have a right and wrong situation, you almost always know the answer. But if you think about ethical dilemmas you have in your life or your work, you will see that they're almost never about a right thing and a wrong thing. And if they are about a right thing and a wrong thing and you're having trouble, it's because some other value is also there, whether it's implicit or explicit. So, for example, honesty versus compassion. You um, do you tell someone the truth if you know it'll hurt them? This is a little cartoon I like to show my medical students. Right? No doctor in the world is going to say that to a young patient, even if it's true. Why? Because we value compassion in this situation over honesty. So we have those values like honesty versus compassion. In medicine, autonomy versus beneficence. The doctors face this all the time. Do I do what's in the best interest of my patient, or I do what my patient wants me to do? And sometimes those are in grave conflict. Or individual liberty versus common good. That's what every political system argues about. How much do we favor the value of individual liberty, which we do very much in the West and even more in the US, versus common good, which they do more in the Eastern countries. And so difficult ethical dilemmas almost always involve not a right versus a wrong, but two rights in conflict, two desire or more, three, four, five desired values in conflict. We can't honor them all. So how do we prioritize? How do we weigh which values to favor over which other values? And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here. So that's what ethics is, in my view. And now I'm going to move to ethical decision making. How do you identify an ethical situation? Well, as I said, they always involve these two things, a value proposition and some relationships in tension, whatever those relationships are. And it becomes an ethical challenge when an action needs to be taken. If action doesn't need to be taken, then it's just a wonderful theoretical conversation. And then we have these values that we perceive to be of equal weight. If they're not of equal weight, then it's clear what to do. And now we have to argue and adjudicate and think about which of these values do we honor and which value do we move to the background because we can't honor both of them. In work and in life, we have two different kinds of ethics. We have what I call practical ethics, and that's the ethics of every day. I believe we make ethical decisions at almost every moment. What we buy, how we present ourselves each day, how we talk to each other. These are our values in action. That's what I define ethics as. And a practical ethics is a rational decision, taking into account emotional and other factors too. What you determine is the best ethical conduct in a situation. And then you have to have the ability to defend that. How should I act now? What are the relevant things to consider? Why should I act the way I'm going to act? But then, in addition, we have professional ethics, the ethics of whatever professional group you belong to, the standards, norms, rules, and principles that an organized group working in the same occupation develops and holds to be the ideal way to practice that occupation, that profession. Some professions have written codes of ethics. The American Medical Association was founded in 1847 by reading their code of ethics on the steps of the Academy of Natural Science in Philadelphia. And that's how they founded, by saying, this is what we stand for. And those ethics have to live in a society. The profession lives in a society, so you incorporate broader social norms in addition. But within the context of those, there are extra obligations to a profession. That is, the profession takes on certain values and agrees to engage in certain practices that the general public does not necessarily agree upon, either because they're not engaged in that activity, like medicine, or because they believe it is the highest standard of that profession, like wealth management. So, if it's true that most adult dilemmas involve choosing between competing values, competing rights, it's important to understand why it is we sometimes think ethics is arbitrary. I hear that a lot. People ask me that, well, isn't ethics just what any one person thinks is right? And it's not. Here's the insight that I think is really important to understand about ethics. If you and I are arguing about values and a third person comes in and we have a complex situation, and we're arguing about what we should do and we disagree with each other, it's not because one of us is right and one is wrong. It's because we're weighting these values, these competing values differently. You are suggesting that one value should take precedence. I'm suggesting another. And that is a very understandable and defensible position for us to take. It's what ethicists do all the time. But what's important to understand there is within that range of good answers, there are a lot of bad answers. There are answers that don't deserve equal weight in that conversation. So ethics isn't arbitrary at all. It has a range of possible good answers, but it's got a large range of answers we all agree are bad or wrong. It's not just what anyone there thinks is right. And if someone comes in with one of those bad answers, hopefully, if the other people are good ethicists, they will show that person why that decision shouldn't be considered as a possibility amongst the range of good decisions. And then we'll argue which of the good decisions are the most acceptable, are the best, and why. So the question is therefore, how do I act in a way that accomplishes the appropriate ends, serves the highest value that I think is important here, and also, by the way, that produces the fewest negative consequences? So that's an important caveat, because some people who argue extreme positions, extreme utilitarians or others, argue that position to the point where it can lead to really bad outcomes. The classic argument against utilitarian, if I do the greatest good for the greatest number, well, the greatest good for the greatest number could actually be killing a bunch of innocent people and distributing their organs to everybody who needs one. We're saving 30 lives by killing 3 people. Isn't that the greatest good for the greatest number? No, because there's a profound negative consequence. It can't just be choosing the value. You also have to look at the consequences of that choice. So how you make your decision and how that decision is executed matters. So I just want to very quickly tell you, we train people in ethics, often corporations. We've done a lot of banks and law firms, and we have a whole methodology, and I certainly can't go through it here. It takes much longer, but I just want to show you what the bare bones of it are so you can see how complex this are. So the first thing is to determine the facts. Do I have the right facts to make a good decision? Have I confirmed them? What else do I need to know? Have I manufactured any facts, which people do all the time? Then second, what's the context? Is there something I need to know about the context of this set of decisions? And why should or shouldn't the context affect the decision? Sometimes the context is more important than the facts. Third, who are all the stakeholders? Interesting question in wealth management. Are your stakeholders only your clients or also the clients' families? Are they the legacy institutions that they're giving their resources to? Who are the stakeholders and what is your responsibility for them? Do you understand their role? Is there some emotional context? And we'll talk about this in a second for some stakeholders that I need to understand. Are there stakeholders I should talk to before making my ethical decision? Then the idea of the role. We inhabit different roles in our lives, and those different roles have different ethical responsibilities. My role as a father, a husband, a professor, a friend, a small business owner. I have a LLC, as a colleague. All of these are roles that have ethical content to them. And very often the ethical dilemmas we face as adults are dilemmas of our roles in conflict. What is my responsibility for this role, which is coming up against my responsibility for that role? Analyzing the facts. Have I analyzed them correctly? Have I put them together appropriately? Have I distinguished facts from unverified claims and so on? And then what principles and duties are implicated in this situation? Which values should be served and why? Then the decision comes to do the action, and then we have to review the action and actually defend it. One of the things we always say is, You made your decision, you're going to do it. Is that a decision you're willing to have published in the newspaper? Is that a decision you're willing to defend to third parties not involved? If not, you have to, and maybe there are decisions that are appropriately not defensible to people outside, but if they're not, we really have to think carefully about why not. And then I just want to say, and I won't go into this either, there are a lot of reasons people make bad ethical decisions. Bad information, bad analysis of the information they have, bad distinguishing between important and not important information, et cetera. You can read those. And then there are sort of psychological factors too. Self-serving bias is a very, very big one, especially if you deal with wealth. Are you really doing what's in the best interest of your client? Or is there some self-interest involved there? Normalization of deviance. Well, everybody is doing this, even though I think what my client is doing may not be in the highest ethical standards. Everyone else is doing it too. Conformity bias. All my colleagues act this way. And then things like time pressure and self-righteousness. So we could go over all these and all of the methodology in great detail, but of course we don't have time. If any of you are more interested in this, please just get in touch with me. And now I'm going to say a few words about wealth management and philanthropy. When I was young, right after college, I thought I might want to be a clinical psychologist. So I moved out to San Francisco and I enrolled in the Gestalt Institute of San Francisco. Gestalt therapy was started by Fritz Perls. He was gone by then, but his wife Laura Perls was running the institute, also a very famous and great psychologist. And so there I was sitting there. I was by far the youngest person in the room. And I was nervous. And I was then astonished because I was too young. You'll all get this. But I was astonished at the age of 22 or 23 when Laura Pearl said to the assembled new group, before you leave here, in your personal therapy, there are two things that you must talk about. And if you don't talk about these two things, then you won't be able to graduate and you'll have to come back and talk about them. The first is your parents. And the second is money. That shocked me at 22. Of all the things in the world that I might be psychologically impelled to talk about, money, it just didn't make any sense to me. And of course, the reason for parents is they're the conduit to talk about love, about legacy, about one's responsibility to parents, parents' responsibilities to children. Some of them were parents. Some of them were grandparents in the room. About relationships, which is so important psychologically. And then that was sort of the inward focus. It's about love and ourselves and our psychology and our relationships with people. So they considered that sort of looking inward. The issue of money was about how we express will and power in the world, what we think about security, how we relate to our jobs, our careers, our way of being in the world. And that they saw as an outward focus. And that's why they picked parents and money. I thought after I was there for a while, and of course I took a different career path, but I thought it was a brilliant, if you're going to pick two, there's something really powerful about saying these are the two we're going to talk about. And of course, you can see, I hope clearly what the relationship here is to the kind of work you do, because isn't estate planning about love and power, who we love, who we want to give our resources to now and after we've passed, and what we love, how we want to support work in the world through our resources. And I think it expressed values in two senses. One is that way the Gestalt Institute wanted us to think about it. How do we think about power in the world? How do we express our need to use what we've accumulated in our lives and our work to make some difference? Money is a source of power in the sense that it can make things happen. But people often have perhaps distorted views of money too. For some people, it's a scorecard for their achievements. The more money they have, the more they think they've made it in the world. It can be a security blanket, especially for those who are brought up in some deprived situation. But of course, what money can be is a conduit, a way to achieve goals in the world. And so the question then becomes, what the ethical issue is, values are we serving by how we use our money? And that, of course, is true not just about wealth management. It's true about, when we walk out of our house to go to the houses, to go to the grocery store or to the drugstore, exactly how we spend that money, whether we think about it or not, is expressing some of ethical values. So what values are you interested in expressing through giving? I'm sure, knowing many of you who are on this call and people in wealth management, that is a background question that's always on the mind of the people I've met in who do this kind of work. And I'm sure that you talk about it with your clients, but of course, that is to me the ethical question of estate planning and philanthropy. What are the values you are interested in expressing? What are the values that you serve? What are the messages you're sending by how you distribute your wealth in life and in death? So I think of our use of resources as not just a transfer of wealth, but a transfer of values. Because through transferring wealth, we state very firmly what our set of important values are. So I want to talk now, step out of the wealth management as an activity and go to a background question. I taught a wonderful course a couple of semesters ago with 4 of the curators from the Carlos Museum at Emory and a professor from the Goizueta Business School on the ethics of museums and curation, which is a fascinating topic. Most people don't think about it, but curators have all kinds of ethical issues. And we spent an enormous time on the issue of the ethics of ownership. And when I started doing this kind of work, one of the first groups I did it, by the way, with, and did it a number of times, was Diversified Trust here in Atlanta. We talked and thought about the ethics of ownership, and I showed them a film called The Art of the Steal about the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Fascinating case study. I'm from Philadelphia. I was at the Barnes Foundation many, many times. Barnes was a very wealthy guy who invented a way to put drops in the eyes of newborns and to keep them from blindness, and actually cut blindness in the United States and in the world in infants by about 80%. So he's a remarkable guy, a great healer. And he was one of the very first people to understand the power of French impressionism. I mean, not just French, but he went to Europe and he bought impressionist paintings all over Europe and accumulated the greatest and most valuable private collection of art, some people said, in the world. And he had, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but he had like 30 Picassos and, just all of the great impressionists. He just bought their work when nobody had heard of them and when they were very reasonably priced. And he set them up in a foundation called the Barnes Foundation, which was in a building in a suburb of Philadelphia. And he hated the Philadelphia art establishment. They all thought he was crazy. They all thought the art he was buying was worthless. And so he left a will that under no circumstances should his art ever go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art or ever be part of the establishment art collection of Philadelphia. He set up a charitable foundation to let people who normally don't get to see that kind of art come to the Barnes Foundation for free. He had his own theory of how art should be shown, and it was shown in very particular configurations. Then he died. And for a while, the Barnes Foundation continued on. I went there many times. I lived very close to it. And then at one point, the Philadelphia art establishment decided they wanted that collection. And if you want to see the story of it, rent The Art of the Steal. It's a wonderful movie. It's very one-sided, but it's a great story. And the Philadelphia art establishments put together a strategy to take his art. I won't go into all the details, as fascinating as it is, but the bottom line is they got it. They took his entire art collection. They built a wing of the Philadelphia Museum of Art called the Barnes Foundation Wing, and they now have all of his art on display, at least in the configuration that he wanted it to be. That was one concession. But exactly what he wanted not to happen happened. And so we had a long talk in this class about what it means to own something. What does it mean to own something valuable? What does it mean to own a piece of art for the world? Wait, let me hold off from that for a second. What if I own a Da Vinci? Do I have a right to burn it? Do I have a right to stick it in a vault and say no one gets to see this, and then leave it to my children and say you only get to keep this if you keep it in the vault? I don't want anyone to ever see this. What is our responsibility, not just to the sort of dollars that we give, but what does it mean to own things over time? When does that expire? If I own something and I want to leave it to my children, do I get to control it for the next 500 years? This was one of the arguments around the Barnes Foundation art. And what do I owe to society? So the ethics of ownership becomes itself a fascinating theoretical issue around the question of wealth transfer. And then there's the question of the ethics of inheritance. Are there ethical issues about the distribution of wealth to the next generation? You know, I like to think of a continuum right now. This could change because it did once, of sort of Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk. So Bill Gates used to be criticized a lot early in his career for not giving enough of his wealth away. Then he created the Gates Foundation, and of course has done amazing work in public health and other things. And Warren Buffett doesn't have a Buffett Foundation. He gave his money to the Gates Foundation because it wasn't important to him to have a foundation with his name on it. And he did the same thing with his children. He told his children, you will get the following amount of money of inheritance. And by the way, given his wealth, it was not a lot of money. And he said, I'm giving the rest away, and it's your obligation to build your own wealth and distribute your own wealth. So these are kind of values being expressed in the world through the act of inheritance, through the act of giving. In this case, a questioning of what he actually owes his children, given his enormous wealth. And his decision was, I don't owe them my entire wealth. I don't even owe them the bulk of my wealth. I owe them enough to give them a kickstart in the world, and then the rest is their responsibility. And the rest of Warren Buffett's money is going to what he sees as the public good. And there's the question of fairness. Knight Kiplinger writes the Kiplinger letter, this big business letter that's very well regarded in the business world. And he once said, and he writes a column where he answers questions. He did. He's not anymore, but this is from many years ago. And he said the single thing he wrote that he got the most letters about was about a mother who had written to him. She had 3 kids. Her daughter was very, very wealthy. And she had sons. One was was a social worker. And so she had decided to leave, and she was very wealthy, the bulk of her money to her teacher and social worker sons, and to leave a much lesser amount to her daughter. So Kiplinger wrote back, he thought that was perfectly reasonable and ethical to favor the of less resources, the daughter who has more. And he said that he was deluged with letters and calls from estate planners who said, you can't do that. It's going to tear the family apart. So what does fairness mean in those What is fair? An equal amount to children, some of whom don't need it, or favoring the children who need it more and potentially alienating your other children. And of course, the key to all of this is communication. Um, I've done a number of sessions of this with wealthy families, and I did it with one family. And when I got to the issue of communication, how do you communicate your decisions and your plans to the next generation so that it doesn't become an issue when you die and the will is read? I just sat back because the younger generation of that very wealthy family immediately turned to the older generation and started arguing about the fact that they didn't feel like they were communicated with enough. And there were all of these things they didn't know. And it got into this big conversation, which never got angry or bitter. It was a very good, honest conversation about what it is the older generation, in terms of information, owed the next generation. But the Kiplinger letter, I told them about it too, really sparked that question of how do you make sure that that younger generation doesn't feel a sense of resentment over these kinds of issues. So what is the responsibility of the wealth manager or the estate planner in these kinds of situations? There are questions worth asking about it. To what degree should you think of yourself as an ethical guide for clients? I'm sure most of you do in some way or another through asking important questions, gentle ethical questions. And what are those questions? What are the questions that you should be asking clients, not about practical matters, but about values and ethical questions? I hope you talk about that amongst yourselves. And I would love to be a fly on the wall and hear that conversation to see how you generate what you think are the values you should be bringing into question. Obviously, it's not your job to impose values on your clients, but how do you evoke them? And how do you get perhaps the clients who are less likely or have a less of a tendency to think that way to begin to ask those questions of themselves? Because I think the most productive and satisfying use of those resources is in service of the client's values. And sometimes that needs to be evoked and made explicit for the client themselves to be able to understand, well, maybe I am not configuring my resources in the way that best expresses what I want to express in the world. What do you do when you see an unethical action on the part of a client? What is your responsibility? And this is a question that plagues every profession. Lots of people say, I will go and I will report it, or I will talk to them about it. But of course, as we all know, in the practical world, in real situations, that's often a lot harder to do than it sounds like when we're all sitting here at our desks thinking about it. It's tough to confront people. It's often tough to know what is an unethical action. That is, if I was right that conflicts in values could lead one person to weight one value more and another person to weight a different one more. Maybe it's just a difference in ethical priorities and the client's view is legitimate. So how do you decide when you see something unethical? I mean, some things are very clearly unethical. We all understand that. But how do you decide when you intervene or when you walk away? When is the point at which you say this client's behavior, whatever it is so unethical, I cannot allow my own ethics to be compromised through continuing with this client? Ethics is tough. We like to joke, ethics is not for sissies. There are times that we have to do things that are personally disadvantageous or personally painful in order to maintain our own ethical standards. And we are so good at finding excuses and reasons and rationalizations as to why we're not going to walk away, as why we're not going to confront someone, as why we're not going to disadvantage ourselves. Remember that self-serving piece that before of what happens in ethical situations that distort our ethical view? That is certainly one of them. So the discussion of what to do when you see an unethical behavior, I think is really quite important. What should you do when your values are in conflict with the client, but it doesn't reach the point of unethical behavior, but really very much a values clash? Um, what if you saw a client who wanted to give some of their wealth to an organization that you thought was profoundly problematic for whatever reason? An organization that preached something that you thought was destructive to society or was profoundly unethical. Is your obligation as a professional with the client simply to do what the client wants, or do you have higher obligations to some set of ethical standards you believe in? Again, these are not questions that have simple answers. These are questions that every professional, whether you're talking about lawyers, doctors, um, uh, it doesn't matter, have to confront all the time over and over again in their careers and keep interrogating the question themselves. And where do they stand on those kinds of issues, and what would they do if those situations arose? And what responsibilities do you have to stakeholders? Your client is this couple. What responsibility do you have, if any, to their children, to the institutions that they're telling you they're going to leave money to, or not leave money to, or other beneficiaries? Do you have any responsibility to them at all? Or is your responsibility only to the client in front of you? This again is a very interesting question. Remember, I said earlier that groups can weigh ethics differently, just like individuals can, the collective. In the West, we value individual freedom. In the East, they prioritize often common good, community good. Well, that's this question too, isn't it? In a society where we value almost to the extent of exclusivity people's individual rights, even at the expense of common good, what happens when you see those two things in conflict? What is your responsibility? And again, it's not simple. And situations are complex, and that tension can manifest itself in many, many different ways. It's simply a question one must ask oneself over and over and over again. And I challenge my students with it all the time. You're in a test, and the person and your friend, your good friend, one of your closest friend next to you is cheating. Is your responsibility to friendship and loyalty, or is your responsibility to the class and the university? So challenging that tension between individual ethical challenge with, especially when it's conflict between the individual and the group good in some way. And the group good can be very, very abstract. If a client wants to give money to an institution that you think is unhealthy for the society, that's a very abstract thing for you to intervene in. And you could simply say to yourself, who am I to make that kind of a decision? Who am I to make that kind of judgment with my client's money? And the question we need to ask ourselves, is that a rationalization, or is that the right ethical stance to take? And we can, that's the kind of debate we can have over and over again. So I'm just going to conclude. I know I concluded a little early, but I actually like the conversation more than the presentation. So I'm giving us some extra time for Q&A and some extra time for comments. What I usually do when I teach this, and when I work with families and when I work with groups, at this point, is to give them case studies. And in fact, I have a whole set of case studies that I originally developed with Diversified Trust many, many, many years ago for wealth management, philanthropy, and that kind of thing. And they're interesting, and they're complex. And how do you respond when people give money to children or people give a piece of property. One's about a family farm, and one child wants to sell it, and one wants to build a charitable organization on it, and the third wants to keep it as a family retreat. What do you do when you have a very expensive piece of heirloom jewelry that came down in the family? You can only give it to one child. Should you sell it and distribute the money? So we have these interesting parents becoming incompetent through disease. We have these case studies, and I would love maybe some other time with some of you to work through those with you. In this webinar setting, it's a little more difficult for us to have robust conversation around case studies. So I'm holding that off, but I just wanted you to know that that would be the next step if we were doing this together in a different, in person. I will only end by thanking you for your attention. And I will also say, as I move to this new part of my career where I'm building this new center for Emory, all of the things that I told you are so prominent still in my mind. I see the pursuit of trying to build a center that works on conflict resolution as a part of the kind of work we all do. You, I'm sure, are often engaged in some kind of conflict resolution with your clients. So I hope this has been somewhat helpful for you, and I would love for us to spend the next few minutes interacting through, is it through the chat or the Q&A? Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Walpe. We do have a question in the Q&A, and it's from one of our audience members. The question goes, in a wealth transfer context, or more generally, are there any particular values you repeatedly see clients or people weigh heavily initially, but often regret or downweight this value later in life with greater experience or age?
Well, I would like you all who are watching this webinar to answer that question in the Q&A or chat or whatever the appropriate place is. Yourselves, what do you see? I'm not a wealth management professional. So what do you see as the values that younger people weigh heavily and older people don't? Okay, there's no question they're there. I look at myself, I'm 67. I look at my 67-year-old Paul, and sometimes I'm a bit aghast at the values of 30-year-old Paul. I hope we all mature over time. I hope our value set gets better as we get older. I hope we gain some wisdom, if not what's aging for. So I hope that values ripen and mature with age and priorities change over time. There are priorities appropriate for 30 that aren't appropriate for 70. And so, yes, I think the answer is yes. The details of it, I mean, I could talk about values that I think people hold, but in terms of wealth management itself, in terms of the kind of work you do, I'd be much more interested to have you all answer the question. Are there values that you repeatedly see clients weigh heavily initially, but over time?
Yeah, I think what we
Yeah.
can do is just sort of open that up to the group and let everybody that's in attendance sort of chime in there. You can put your answer in the Q&A, and then maybe if we've got enough responses, we can sort of repeat those or list the ones that are appearing more often. I do have a couple of other questions. These are more just sort of broader ones, but do you think that the concentration of wealth undermines democracy or social equality? And how can society sort of balance, the personal freedom to pass on wealth with against the need for equitable opportunities for,
Yeah.
everyone in society?
Yes. So I think the answer is yes. There is a level of concentration of wealth that undermines democracy. I think we're seeing it right now in our culture. And we can name it the power that Elon Musk has as an unelected part of our government is clearly due to his wealth. I mean, that's not controversial to say. So wealth can create disproportionate interference in the democratic process. That doesn't mean I'm against wealth or that I believe that we need to even things out completely, but there is a level of disproportionate wealth that I think undermines things. And we in the United States are particularly guilty of this. If you look at, CEO's salary versus base salaries in the US versus every other Western country, it's wildly disproportionate here compared to other countries. We believe in wealth in the United States, and we think wealth does good things. And we're very reluctant to criticize wealth as a nation, no matter how great it gets in proportion. Even if people end up owning the wealth of small countries, that seems to be fine with us. I don't think it's an ethical stance to concentrate resources to that degree in any one person, because we're all idiosyncratic. And what ends up happening is that the particular peculiarities of that individual get in, incorporated into the body politic without any ability for the democratic public to stop it. So yes, I think it's a profound problem here, less of a problem in other places. But then, there are some other places where, some, countries that have great oil wealth or other things where they have these citizens with disproportionate wealth. And sometimes it's one and the same. That is, if you look at some countries in the Middle East, the wealthiest people are the rulers. And so there you've got both. You've got it. You've got the wealth actually incorporated itself into the governing body. And I think that that's deeply problematic also.
Yeah. So is there anything our society, I guess, we could do to ensure that philanthropy at the end of the day supports, the public good and not private wealth? Or
So there are two questions there. First of all, what do we do about this enormous disproportionate wealth? And I think the answer is to change our taxation policy to try to bring more of that corporate wealth into the public coffers. But then when it comes to philanthropy, it's a really tough question. One of the things, so I spent the last since June, however many months that is, during that time, I've been trying to build this new center. So I spent 14 weeks in Europe, and I visited, I was in 19 cities, and I visited 30 organizations that do conflict transformation and peace building in all the cities in Europe that you think I would go to: Geneva and The Hague and Oslo and Helsinki and Zurich and Basel and all these cities that are known for conflict resolution. And one of the stories I got over and over again was how competitive the field was. That is, these big organizations that have to pay the rent and pay their employees are competing with other such big organizations to go to certain particular places in the world and be the vehicle for conflict resolution. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of other places in the world with grave conflicts where nobody goes. And the reason nobody goes there is because there's not money to go and solve those conflicts, while in some very high profile places, there's lots of money to go there. So we have this problem in every field of human endeavor where we choose which problems we think are worthy of funding, and other similar problems are neglected. And the big question for me as an ethicist is that problem solved in some way through personal philanthropy, or is it made worse by personal philanthropy? And the answer, of course, is both. I mean, some philanthropists will take their considerable resources and try to put them on problems that are underserved. And other philanthropists will take their money and try to put them in problems that give them the highest profile, which is rarely the really underserved things. And that's why I use Warren Buffett as such an example, because he's never about personal aggrandizement, right? He uses his money, he gives his money away without asking for a lot of personal credit for it. He doesn't put his name on it. That still doesn't mean he necessarily targets the things that are most in need. So I think philanthropy in that sense is a mixed bag. It's much more facile and nimble than government funds. I mean, if I have enormous resources and I want to put them in a problem, I can put them into that problem tomorrow. That's not going to happen when you do it publicly. So it allows a certain kind of facility that we don't get with public funds, but it requires our trust in individuals. And often those individuals made that money, perhaps not through the most ethical sets of behaviors or with the most ethical sets of values, and yet we're trusting them to use that money to try to solve tough social problems. So I know that's a non-answer, but I think it is very much a mixed blessing.
I think that was a good answer. Well, it seems like we don't really have any more participation from the group in terms of the earlier question regarding values that are weighed heavily initially and then later, regretted or downweighted. Really, I think I want to thank you again for your presentation, and I'll let my co-chair, Mary Frances, sort of give us the closing remarks.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Frances Callis at Diversified Trust, and I promise I did not know that Diversified Trust would be plugged so much today. We did not pay extra for that in our sponsorship, but I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Paul, for your presentation. This year, we did split the Balser celebration and today's symposium into 2 events. Again, the past few years, they've been combined. So I do want to tell you all to add our celebration and networking cocktail event. That will be Thursday, April 24th. Add that to your calendars. It's at the Thompson Hotel in Buckhead, and we will be sending out, or ACAN will be sending out information about that so that you can register and make sure to attend. If you would like to receive CE credit for today's presentation, you can email Veronica Diaz at vdiaz, D-I-A-Z, at jewishatlanta.org, and she will handle getting that CE credit for you, either CPE, CLE, or CFPE, CE. Lots of letters there. But thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on April 24th. Bye, everybody.